Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much to Katie for introducing our conference for us. And I wanted to give you my own welcome to our Learning and Teaching Conference. And as Mamadou described, it's been a long time in the making, but here we are at last. I've used the title of Roadmaps and Pathways, Navigating the COVID Years. And if perhaps my presentation could start now so that you can see our slides. Right. So roadmaps and pathways navigating the COVID years. And my talk today reflects on the impact COVID is having on us as teachers and on our students as learners. But I hope as well that it will give us some thoughts on the opportunities that will start to open up, since buried in the stresses and strains of today are the seeds of learning that we can nurture for tomorrow. We move to the next slide, please. So where we're at now, some of you may have been at the kind of mini conference that we did last September that focused a lot on personal tutoring and in other ways to kind of get us ready for the coming academic year. And if you were there, you remember that I showed you this montage in a more kind of lively way. These scenes are from a very long-running American serial of shorts called The Perils of Pauline, where Pauline was continually put in peril and equally continually worked her way out of the peril. And at that time, you might remember that the picture that you can see in the center, where Pauline is kind of wrestling her opponent to the ground, I used that at the end, and it was quite big. And there was a sense that, Pauline was going to triumph, and so should we, so would we. I still think we will triumph, but I think probably at the moment, for many of us, we feel the pressures and the perils even more strongly than we might have done then. And hence I've minimized the picture this time around to acknowledge that those perils and stresses are very real and feel very real. We do feel, I think, in certain ways dominated by COVID, and hence the prominence of that picture must be smaller. So what I want to do is go through some evidence of the impact that our COVID-inflected mixed mode teaching is having, both on our students and on ourselves, before we start thinking a little bit about the future and what it might bring. Have the next slide, please. So I'm going to start with the impact on our students, and I've got some data to show you, basically some information from our DMU Student Experience Tracker, from the Are You OK campaign that's being co-run through DSU and DMU. Some of you may have known that we undertook a student survey trying to ask them what they would like to see in terms of lockdown mitigations. And finally, a little bit of information about the way our hardship funds are currently being accessed by our students. I think it's really fair to say that our students are struggling, and sharing with you some headlines from these four areas just give you a sense of the ways in which they are struggling and some of the things that we see that they are telling us. So we could have the next slide, please. So this is regrettably a little small, but the Student Experience Tracker is something that Market Insights and Marcoms sends out on a regular basis. It went out last November. That is the kind of first column. And recently, or it's out right now with a closing date of Monday. So we're kind of comparing November when we were in our blended mode, and January, February when we're in the more or less full lockdown, with the exception of those limited programs in health and life sciences that are health and clinical and otherwise health related, where we have been allowed to bring our students back. Now, as of yesterday, there were 1,280 returns to the survey, so undoubtedly there will be a bit more. And as I said, these numbers cover the move from when we were in a hybrid mode, which we hope to be able to get back to, into the full lockdown mode that we are in now. I think it's important to note the declining levels of satisfaction. I think probably most of us have certain issues with thinking about terms like satisfaction, but in many ways it's a shorthand for how our students are feeling about their experience, and so we need to take this into account. So what we can see from the tracker so far is a significant deterioration or decline in student levels of satisfaction between last November and where we are now. So the overall experience from feeling 33.8% feeling satisfied, not great, but 18.5% really not great. Teaching and learning experience from 36.5% feeling satisfied to 23.9%. And overall course quality from 53.2% to 38.3%. Now, none of this, of course, is a reflection on the, what you might say, the inherent course quality of what we are offering our students. But clearly there is a difference between what we could offer them when we were planning for the kind of mixed mode and what in many areas is now having to be completely online, with all of the restrictions that brings. We have the next slide, please. The Are You OK campaign that DMU and DSU are running together has so far had 3 iterations, November, December, and January. There's a lot of really useful information, really rich information in it about how our students are feeling. And it's important to notice that this campaign follows the student language of okayness. So are you feeling okay? Are you feeling, how are you feeling? It's less, I think, about satisfaction, more about the emotional impact of the situation that we are currently in. And it's true, I think, that if students don't feel okay, they will not be able to learn at their best. Now, I'm just sharing with you one slide from a number of slides, but if we look at this one where 0 is the lowest and 10 is feeling great, you can see how the 4 and between 4 and 6 is where we really get that high point. But the majority of our students are not feeling okay, of those who answered this particular survey. We also know that of the students who answered, about 65% were finding and are finding blended learning difficult. And in terms of the reasons that they give for this, the top 6 reasons have to do with learning style. They're not necessarily prepared for or set up to learn in this way. Lecture availability, and clearly it's more difficult for us to be available for our lecturers when we can't be sort of physically present and they can't simply say talk to us after a lecture or a seminar or find us in our offices. Internet access, communication, resources, and equipment. We move to the next slide, please. We undertook a student survey on lockdown mitigations a couple of weeks ago now. And one of the questions that we asked them, this was to the general student body of taught students, their preferred mitigations in terms of what we might be able to do to help them support them through the lockdown that we are currently in. This survey garnered 1,061 responses. And again, you can see where their real concerns lie. The majority of them really wanted to see us undertake a review of our deadlines. They want to see us providing a wider range of financial support and more streamlined extenuating circumstances and other sort of bureaucratic processes. And within that as well, you can see some of the responses in some of the other areas that they were still interested in, but in a way less so. These student concerns, I think, are about being able to do their best work. They're hugely fearful that they can't do their best work in the current situation, and they are concerned that somehow we're not understanding that and we're not being able to help them with that. Now, I know we do understand that and we do want to help them, but here we're thinking about how the students feel about it. All of our best planning could never have mitigated against this kind of lockdown. Even though, as you know, we had second wave guidelines that said people should be prepared to be able to pivot to online teaching for a 4 to 6 week period, we're already now into the latter end of that 4 to 6 week period. And it looks like we've got at least the rest of the month of February, if not a little bit into March to go. So there's no way we could have fully prepared for this. And I think we all acknowledge that, but our students nonetheless feel the impact. So by asking for extensions, for financial support, for simpler processes when they run into difficulty, what I think they're saying to us is that they do want to do their best work and they fear that they can't, and can we somehow enable that? Now, we also ran a survey for students on practical courses, for mainly in ADH and a few in Chem, where for them, alongside these elements, also access to materials and equipment was also very high on the list. And I'm sure we can all understand why that makes sense. So these results and other conversations have informed our approach to our university safety net approach, which is going to take the place of what we were calling no detriment last year, which is currently with academic board for approval, but which in the main really seeks to lighten the bureaucratic burden on students so that when they run into COVID-related difficulties, they can come to us with those difficulties and we can respond easily, I think, to them. we have the next slide, please? In terms of access to hardship funds, this is thinking about not only the money that we ourselves apply to our hardship funds, but the money that the Office for Students and the government have made available to universities in England. Now, we've had the 6th highest allocation of funding, of this special funding in the first tranche. And what that indicates is a recognition that our students are among the neediest students in the country. As of earlier this week, there had been 804 applications to this fund. So far, only 81 awards, but that's because of the time it takes to work through the applications, but already awarding £86,500 in total. And so far, only 27 awards bids have been rejected because they were deemed to have adequate funds. That's a very low rejection rate in comparison with how it sometimes goes. Now, we knew from last spring, that our students experience real digital disadvantage. This turned into a sector issue, but it hits our students particularly hard. Lockdown, once again, deprives many of our students of their access to university facilities. So if they don't have, for instance, equipment or whatever at home, before we went into lockdown, they could come onto campus, they could use computer labs, etc. This is not impossible now, but it's clearly a lot harder for them. The funds are also available to help support students with accommodation costs and lost wages. DMU has waived accommodation rental costs for our own halls. And I can't remember when the cutoff date of that, but it essentially will work, I think, as long as lockdown is in place. But some students are having to support themselves in accommodation costs at 2 different locations. And we know that the very sectors that most of our students would be able to find paid work in are the ones that are now unable to be open because of lockdown. As I said, there's a very low number of rejected applications, and what it really shows us is that, among other things that I've already noted, our students are desperately worried about their finances. Can we have the next slide, please? But I don't want to give the impression that I think that the COVID is only having an impact on students. It's obviously having a very strong impact on all of us and all of you as staff as well. There was a survey that came out yesterday in the THE, an article around staff say online teaching means more work and worse mental health. So I've just on this slide put a few quotations from that article that shows from the responses to this survey where academic staff feel they are in a mixed mode or an online mode of teaching. And I think it's unsurprising. It feels really tough. The context for staff who must balance student needs with their own is clear in something like this. 61% of respondents strongly agreed that their workload had increased following the halting of on-campus tuition. If we add in the 28%, well, that is almost everybody. The move to online teaching had a negative impact on their mental health. Again, 51% agreed, only 27% disagreed. And respondents also expressed concern about the impact of online learning on their students. This survey was a global survey, but the largest contingent of responses did come from the UK. I think there's no question but that online and mixed mode teaching is onerous and difficult. And the fact that people have had to learn how to do new things very quickly only adds to that. And yet at the moment, we really have no alternatives. Can we have the next slide, please? And if I attempted to kind of pull together what I feel is the overarching impact on staff, doing the job in a new way, mastering new technologies and techniques, also retaining somehow the personal touch that we know we value with our students and we know that they absolutely rely on with us. The ongoing impact of lockdown, so many colleagues with their own homeschooling and home caring duties and with no real respite from that. Now, in our teaching and learning spaces on campus, there's been a lot of work done, and we know that there is no evidence of teaching space transmission, but that doesn't stop people from feeling worried, about feeling anxious, and worrying really about the safety elements. And then the continued pressure and exhaustion of really not knowing when it will end. So I completely factor into it fatigue, worry, the continued disruption, novelty in a bad way, Here's where I'd somewhat depart from Mamadou's emphasis on positive disruption. We have been massively disrupted, and here it's in a way that is not great. It's in a way that makes us feel uncertain, that makes us feel really wobbly, that makes us feel very anxious. Students look to us for answers and certainty, which is what we often can't give right now. And of course, we want answers and certainty too. As we all know, higher education really loves its routine and it loves its academic cycle. And even though sometimes that can sort of feel a little bit like it's a Groundhog Day, in many ways, the idea that something starts to happen in September-ish, goes through to the next August, and then begins again in the next September, we kind of rely on that to give us a sense of structure, I think, and give us a sense of certainty. And over the last nearly a year now, we have not had this, and we have no real end in sight. I think we can have hope. But then next slide, please. And then, of course, we've got the future. So we have vaccines now. We have more than one vaccine. Hopefully, this is going to start making things a little bit easier for us. What the vaccine does and doesn't offer, though, I think is as yet perhaps not thoroughly clear. Many of us won't yet be in a group that is able to access the vaccine yet. We may be able to be in that group at some point between now and the beginning of the next academic year. Where our students come in that priority order is relatively unclear. The vaccine, of course, isn't a magic bullet that renders everything 100% safe. It gives us a certain amount of comfort. I think it gives us a certain amount of clarity, but it won't solve everything. What it does give us, I think, is at least that next step towards thinking that COVID will eventually become something that we know how to deal with, we know how to cope with. If we think about learning disruption in schools, as opposed to, well, if we start last spring and going forward, our current year 13 students had about a third less learning, even without the current lockdown, because of how early in the last academic year their learning stopped in any kind of proper way. Our current year 12 students had their GCSEs canceled, so no real examination experience, a fragmented this year, and uncertainty in terms of the coming year. Our current year 11 students have had less learning than they would have had, and their upcoming exams to be canceled. So what this really indicates for us, I think, as university teachers, is that our level 4 students for the next 3 to 5 years are going to come to us with a very different level of preparation and a very uneven knowledge base. And that is something that we are going to have to think about. And here I want to go back to Mamadou's positive disruption. Here's where we're going to have to think about this in creative ways. It will mean that things will be new and different for us teaching those students. We need to keep in mind what that's going to look like and how we can make that work effectively for them. And then there are various sector issues that keep coming towards us as well. PQA, post-qualification admissions, there is a lot of energy and movement towards this now. I expect that we will get there in the next couple of years, and that will have certain impacts again on the academic cycle, on potentially the start of the academic year, on the way in which we approach admissions. The new look TEF, TEF is coming back. It's coming back in what the government, I think, intends to be a lighter touch way, more along the lines of a ref cycle probably, rather than something annual. So thank goodness for that. It looks extremely unlikely that there will be anything like a subject level TEF in the future, which I think is also good news for us, mainly in terms of the fact that subject level TEF, while it could give some very interesting information, was extremely burdensome in putting together the kind of work that would give anything meaningful at the end of it. So there will be a new kind of TEF that we will have to be thinking about and being prepared for. And the interim response to the Augur report, which is really focusing on things like higher technical qualifications at level 4 and 5, creative working with FE. We've got a good relationship with Leicester College that we can build on, and also an approach to modular qualifications and thinking about modular-based learning as opposed to program-based learning. There are definite opportunities in there that we as a university can pick up. So as I start to pull this together, I would like to say that our way is clear to a post-COVID destination, but unfortunately I can't yet fully. We could have just the next picture on the slide, please. In many ways, I feel often like this, and it is not the world's most comfortable feeling. The sector has done a huge amount of work to keep the way clear for staff and students. You have done that, and you continue to do this huge amount. And unlike other sectors in our country and the world where money can fix the issue, so the retail sector or the travel sector or things like that, where money can fix the issue. In education, we will have a few years where our pathways are muddy and unkempt. Money is always welcome, but money in itself won't solve issues around, for instance, the learning disruption that our school children are feeling. So it's all the more important to keep in mind the people, all of us, that are at the forefront of our thinking. So I've wanted to share with you the difficulties that our students are feeling, not because I don't think you don't know about them, but because I know you do know about them, and I know that your empathy is being called on repeatedly. Now, this day is therefore a celebration of you and of the work that you do to elevate the learning experience despite all that COVID throws at us. The University of Tomorrow will bear the imprint of the pressures we feel today. We could just have the last picture, please. But it will also be the wonderful place that we know universities are and that we know that our university is. So despite the gloomy overtone of my talk, and I do apologize for that, I am also rejuvenated by the energy and creativity that you all continue to show. I think we'll clear our path to post-COVID together, and we will walk down the pathway that I'm showing you now together. So thank you very much for listening. And because I think we are a little bit ahead of time, I think it might be possible to perhaps take a couple of questions. We can bring back to the full screen. So I will attempt to see if there are a few questions coming up. So from Jonathan, the teaching space transmission a little more, please. I'll do my best. There's been quite a bit of investigation into evidence for transmission within teaching spaces in both at school and higher education. And what it has shown is that there's very little evidence that there's been transmission in teaching spaces. Transmission mainly occurs in community spaces, in hospitality, for instance, as we know very much from the experience at the beginning of the academic year in higher education, in student halls of residence, mainly because of the way in which students live together in a very close-knit way. But teaching spaces have been shown to be not to be the spaces where there's a risk of transmission. And that, I think, is important to keep in mind. The work that DMU has done, the work that the sector has done, makes our teaching spaces very low risk in this way. So hope that you can find some of that kind of research as well, just by sort of doing a bit of research of Google research or onto Times Higher Education. There's been reports on there as well. Teaching space transmission, that simply means that when you're in the teaching space in a socially distanced way, staff and students together, there really isn't any evidence that you're finding transmission of the virus in those spaces. That the transmission of the virus occurs in other social spaces rather than in those teaching spaces. So thank you once again for listening. Thank you once again for all of the work that you are doing. We are a little bit ahead of time, but I believe we may have our next speakers ready to speak to you. Hopefully this has just gained them a little bit of time as well. I do hope that this day is useful for you. It's a wonderful lineup of speakers and presentations. And as Katie and Mamadou have both laid out for you as well, really thinking about the ways in which our University of Tomorrow will be the university that we want it to be. So I will now pass over to Angela and to Dave Parks, and we can listen to what will no doubt be a very interesting talk. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Thank you for everything that you're doing.